Hello class. So last time we looked at the levels of motor control at a very brief detail. Today we will look at those levels of motor control at a more detailed glance. So let's look at level 1, which is the premotor cortex. So the premotor cortex is at this part of the brain, so kind of near the center. This will help in planning which muscles to contract in our somatic nervous system. This will then work with input from the cerebellum, which is found here, and the basal nuclei, which is actually found in the center of your brain. This will send signals to our primary motor cortex. When we then reach level 2, which is the primary motor cortex, this will then help process any fine-scaled movements that we will do. This will then help send signals to the lower motor neurons, and it will send it to the lower motor neuron by the corticospinal tract. So the premotor cortex was here, and it will then send here, which is the primary motor cortex. After it is then sent onto the primary motor cortex, it will then send signals or synapses into the level 3, which is the brainstem nuclei. Input will be received from the cortex, the cerebellum, and the basal nuclei. When those inputs are then received, this will then help coordinate large muscle group movements. So if the large muscles which are found, let's say on your legs, it will help coordinate with those large muscle movements. This will also help with maintaining our posture, very important. After that, this will then send signals to the lower motor neuron by indirect tracks. So this one is going to the lower motor neuron by the indirect tracks. Earlier, it was going to the lower motor neuron by the corticospinal. Remember those differences. So the brainstem nuclei is found here somewhere in the brainstem. Okay? So let's look at level 3 again. So you can think of the brainstem nuclei as kind of like the center of all of these processes, as you are receiving input from, let's say, the cortex. So you are receiving input from the cerebellum, and you're also receiving input from the basal nuclei. The reason why I say this is like the center of the process here with the levels of motor control is that this is between, sending from the upper motor neuron to then the lower motor neuron. So before we send to the lower motor neurons and then the upper motor neurons, it's the brainstem nuclei process is kind of in between of those neuronal networks. We then send signals to the spinal cord, which is composed of cell bodies of the lower motor neurons. And when we are, synapsing onto the spinal cord, this is composed of neuronal networks called central pattern generators. What do these central pattern generators do, and what are their roles? They are responsible for getting the signals from the corticospinal tract, which is mentioned earlier on how signals go from primary to lower motor neuron. It will receive those signals from the corticospinal tract and will help with repeated movements. So repeated movements, things like walking, running, right? It will help initiate that. It will help initiate and stop those repeated movements. Okay? Eventually, the signals will reach to the lower motor neuron itself and to the effector, which is the skeletal muscle. So that kind of goes a bit more on what we talked about last time on the levels of motor control. Now let's look at those inputs that we were talking about that was going onto the brainstem nuclei, which is the cerebellum and the basal nuclei. So let's look at this cerebellum. So the cerebellum can be found on our brain. So it is right beside the brainstem, which is here, and um, the main part of the brain, which is the cortex. Now, the cerebellum itself has various functions. You can remember it by these four main functions. Number one, it is responsible for sending and planning, initiating movements by sending signals to the cortical areas. So by sending signals to the cortical areas, we are able to plan and initiate movements. So before we move a muscle or we move a hand or whatsoever, it has to send signals to the cortical areas. This will also help correct movements by then receiving inputs from the proprioceptors. So I'm just going to highlight that, proprioceptors, and then these. So this will, let's say you want to, let's say, move a muscle and it is moving in a wrong way. The cerebellum has a responsibility to then correct those movements. This will also help maintain muscle tone. And the way it will help maintain muscle tone is by having low muscle tension, okay? And then this will also help coordinate with the skilled voluntary muscle movements. So very skilled muscle movements, it is responsible for coordinating such action. We then have the basal nuclei. So the basal nuclei is not found on the right beside the brainstem, but rather it is found in the center of your brain. So it is found on what we would consider as the cerebral cortex. So the cortex, cerebral cortex. So in the main part of our cerebral cortex, it is found in the center. It has three main roles. Number one is it helps with planning movements, similar to cerebellum. This will also help maintain muscle tone, similar to cerebellum. One distinguishing role it has from the cerebellum would be that it helps suppress unwanted emotions. Okay. So I hope that gives a little bit more detail on the levels of motor control and how it all works together, because you cannot just memorize the levels of motor control of our somatic nervous system. You have to understand the bits and pieces and the steps that takes place and why they take place in order to have a good grasp of understanding of such concepts like these in physiology. So I hope that helps, and I hope you have a good day.